Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to this session on research and publication ethics. Today I will be discussing on research philosophies, namely Positivism, Critical Realism, Interpretivism, Postmodernism and Pragmatism. My name is Dr. Nirbhay Kumar Mishra. I am an assistant professor at Institute of Applied Sciences and Humanities at GLA University, Mathura. Before we move to further session, let's try to recap what we have already discussed in previous sessions. So, we developed our understanding to the research and publication ethics. We understood the topics of this course in detailed manner. We talked about the role of philosophy in shaping of the knowledge and research development. We recognized the role of philosophy, logic and scientific conduct in the research development. We also acknowledged how philosophy and science both impacted one another. So, after this session, learners will learn about research philosophies. They will also come to know about positivism, critical realism, interpretivism, postmodernism and pragmatism. They will understand how research philosophies shape different point of views in researchers. They will understand the relevance of different philosophical perspective in research, and they will understand the different strategies in terms of their positive and negative impacts to the conduct of research. So, let's start with the very idea of research philosophy, what exactly it means. So, when we talk about research philosophy, it's about philosophical principles which constitute different perspectives in research. It's about understanding ontology and epistemology and axiology of the research design. It is about the nature of knowledge, and of course, it's about development of knowledge. It involves research strategy, research problem, data collection and data analysis to draw the conclusions. As Holden and Lynch argues that the paradigm of scientific research is composed of ontology, epistemology and methodology. So, the assumptions which are very basic were from the researchers develop and grow their research point of views and different kind of research philosophies, and they also gather with some different ideas and knowledge. So, before we go to understand these research philosophies in deeper sense, let's try to understand what we did in earlier session also about some logic. We need some warm-ups. So, let's understand what we mean by prepositions. As I told you in earlier session, preposition is a statement which can be true or false. So, an argument consists of propositions and argument can be valid or invalid. So, there are different kind of prepositions we can talk about. So, let's talk about a priori prepositions. A priori means those prepositions or statements which do not depend on our experiences. They are true by its definition. They are necessary and analytic in nature. For examples, bachelors are unmarried man. So, being bachelor is implicit in the idea of being unmarried. So, let's talk about the contingent prepositions. So, contingent prepositions are a posteriori prepositions. They depend on our experiences. They can be either true or false. So, we can say bachelors are unhappy. It may be true or false depending on the real experience. So, let's talk about the third possibility, what Immanuel Kant talked about in his philosophy, talks about synthetic a priori, and that means he combines two analytic and a priori and a posteriori. So example like water is H2O, of course we can say synthetic a priori, like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. It's also synthetic a priori because it is based on kind of necessary relation, but also it requires experience to check the fact. Further, we can understand other kinds of prepositions like tautology. Tautology is like cat is cat. They don't add any meaningful information because they are always true in all best possible words. So contingent, of course, a cat is on the mat is meaningful prepositions because it's a posteriori, and it is about the real world. It is about the fact that can be proved or disproved. And then we talk about contradictory prepositions like a cat is not cat. So Wittgenstein, of course, argued that we have sensical prepositions and we have nonsensical prepositions. If something based on the real experiences of this world and something occurs within the space and time, and that can be true or false, it of course adds some meaning to our knowledge, and that can be sensical. Or otherwise, tautologous and contradictory propositions, they don't add any meaning to our knowledge, and they are the nonsensical. So let's try to understand first of all what is ontology, metaphysics, epistemology in philosophy, and how they constitute the very idea of research philosophy. So let's draw a Venn diagram, right, like this. Yeah. So in one we can talk about ontology, right, and then we can talk about metaphysics, yeah, and then we can talk about epistemology, yes. So of course that's where we can locate here. That's the common area of all these three: ontology, metaphysics, and epistemology. And then we can talk about the idea of research philosophy. Yeah, that's the idea we have to understand. So research philosophy actually constituted from these all ontology, metaphysics, and epistemology, and then we have to understand in what ways it develops the basic principles of research, or how ontology, metaphysics, and epistemology they craft the very research design. So before we move to the deeper discussions on these ideas, let's try to understand fresh researcher's perspective. I have taken these two picks to start with a very fresh scholar. So first, of course, about a laughing woman representing happiness, right? And that's we want that all research scholars developed all sort of knowledge to accomplish their career, and they can add something meaningful to society, and they can be really happy. On the other hand, we have a different picture, right? That's the question asking picture by a scholar. So a fresh researcher is always inquisitive. He asks many questions on the researchers, so to understand. So let's try to understand how this research actually takes place in fresh researcher's mind. So again, we can make a diagram like this. I'm using Venn diagrams to represent these three, right? Facts, of course we have facts, and we have assumptions, right? And then we have hypothesis. Right. So we have to understand that our research actually starts from here, right? Of course, we have certain facts that a researcher knows, right? And based on the facts, we assume certain, may we have the idea, may we have the insights to start with, and then we create certain hypothesis, right? Hypothesis is, you can say initial plan structure by which researchers start the research, develop the research. Later on, we can meaningfully talk about the, whether hypothesis is null hypothesis or he or she can adapt an alternative hypothesis. So hypothesis is the starting point for any researcher to go with and develop researches, right? So let's try to understand in terms of fresh researchers, in terms of a scientific method one can adapt. So of course, first comes the observation. We observe in research, and then we formulate certain research questions, and then of course we talk about this hypothesis, non-alternative, and then we collect the data, and after data we have certain kind of results, and according to results we try to conclude certain points in our researches. So let's talk about what we mean by the null hypothesis and what is about the alternative hypothesis. So null hypothesis means insignificant or no relationship between two variables, and alternative hypothesis refers rejection of null hypothesis. For example, if we take the latest example of the impact of COVID-19, right? Let's talk about the impact of COVID-19, and let's talk about in terms of traditional medicines. Yes, let's talk about the impact of COVID-19 on traditional use of traditional medicine. So we can say if we see these two, and we can say that traditional medicines have made an impact on the immunity of the people in order to protect people from COVID infections. So of course we are going to show the effect that our hypothesis is effective in that. And on the other hand, we can disapprove this, that showing that there are many cases which shows that those people have taken traditional medicines but still they got infected. So again we nullify the point that it has no effect on the traditional medicine, have no effect on the immunity to protect COVID-19. So further, let's move to this idea of ontology, epistemology, methodology, outcomes, and philosophical assumptions. So again, we will take up the case of COVID-19. So ontology, what it refers, first we need to understand what is ontology, right? So ontology is about the nature of being. Ontos means the very being of anything. So let's talk about the COVID-19. If we talk about the COVID-19, how COVID-19 exists. So first we figure out about the ontological arguments. Then we try to understand through the principle of knowledge. We try to understand how we understand the existence of COVID-19 through the symptoms, through the infections, and then we also go further to understand through the methodology, right, how we can diagnose, right, what is the method to understand that COVID virus actually exists and it affects the human health, it's spreading across the world. Then again we talk about this methodology, and we can have a testing through the methods, right, and then we may we have certain outcomes also, right, according to looking at the your samples, pathologist can tell, right, about the infection level and how it has infected your lungs and the other organs. So outcomes, based on outcomes, we can actually talk about the COVID-19's existence, and that's through a kind of research observation that follows the process of ontology, epistemology, methodology, and outcome. And certainly we can have the philosophical assumptions to our epistemology. What kind of philosophical assumptions we take? We can be positivist based on the objective neutral facts, or we can have the other ideologies that we will discuss in the later session. So of course we have discussed about the COVID-19, the case study. So we talked about the existence of COVID-19, then we moved to the how do we know about the COVID-19, right, in terms of infection, in humans, and then we try to understand through the test and diagnostic tests. We definitely different method to research on this COVID-19 infections, and then we have result to to express our points, what we have observed, or to make certain conclusions about the COVID-19, or to formulate the strategies, or we can have the policies also to adhere with to mitigate infection or stop infections. Now, let's talk about further about the research philosophies. So now, let's first try to understand what precisely they mean actually. So when we talk about the positivism, right? So I also discussed in the last session that positivism is based on the scientific attitude. It is a kind of theory which depends on the facts, which can be true or false. So of course in positivism we actually try to research on the reality of any kind, maybe social reality, it may be scientific reality, or any kind of reality, and it depends on the scientific method, wherefrom we can actually make certain generalizations that we do in the scientific discourses. So positivism is kind of direct realism, where your research depends on the objective facts, it depends on the general principles, and by these general principles we can generalize our observations. Coming to this second theory, that's critical realism. So critical realism it explains what we experience in terms of the underlying structure of reality. So critical realism is kind of, first you have observation, right, and then after observation you have the experience of the entity, whatever you want to do on research, then actually you have the critical point of view, and that's where you adapt point of views. A first personal point of view also involves in that critical realism. And then we talk about the interpretivism. Interpretivism differs from these two in the way that there may be some kind of knowledge and there are perspectives, right, and there can be possibility of multiple perspectives, and accordingly you can generate your understanding. So coming to postmodernism, it questions the accepted ways of thinking and give voice to alternative ones. It emphasizes the role of language and power relations. So actually postmodernism it talks about the multiple meanings, multiple structures, where there's no fixed identity, there's no fixed idea. Yeah, they can have a multiple ways of explaining the entities, and they can have multiple ways of defining the things. In the pragmatism, when we come to this idea of pragmatism, actually pragmatism is a kind of utilitarian way of adapting the perspective in research. It is based on the problem solving. So concepts are only relevant when they are supporting action. So action theory and problem solving theory in the research, then if you want to have the solutions of your research anyways, then you adapt the pragmatism in research. So let's try to understand further what is positivism. So positivism is an approach to the study of society that relies significantly on scientific evidences. So here the important thing is that scientific evidence, right, scientific method, such as experiments we talk about, and then we also analyze through the calculation statistics to reveal a true nature of how society operates. That's the important thing. So here we find three important phrases: scientific evidence, right, is the one, and then we talk about the experiments, and then we talk about the calculation statistics, and then we talk about the understanding of social realities. So let's try to understand about the critical realism. So as you can see, in the critical realism, first we start about the experience, right, that is the empirical domain. So knowledge of what is perceived to be happening. So that's about our observations, researchers' observations, right. And after that experience domain, we talk about first we talk about the very periphery, right, upper level, that is the reality of any kind that you observe, right. And then knowledge what and why things are the way things are. Actually you try to observe the reality, and then you move to the actual domain, right, knowledge of actually what happens, and then what you experience. So these three are different levels. There cannot be one structure of reality. There are three different levels: the reality, the way things are, and what they are actually in themselves that we don't know, and then what is my experience to those realities. And that's where we try to understand realism is not the way positivists talk about. It has to be critical realism. We have to understand these three different levels of reality, and we have to understand the gaps also. So that's the way we have to understand that reality and the way things are is different from the way things are in themselves and the way I experience those things. So this is about the critical realism we have to understand. And then let's talk about the interpretivism. So again, we have to understand, first we can have the, let's say we have the Venn diagram. Again, I'm using Venn diagrams because they help me a lot, right? So we can have the, knowledge, right? Knowledge of any theory, right? Any kind of perspective, any view, and then we what we can have, that we have the experience also, right, accordingly, and we can have different perspectives also. Okay, and then we have a different understanding. Okay, so let's talk about interpretivism. So in this interpretivism, we have to understand that reality is not is one of kinds. So reality can be multiple, right, and it depends on the researcher's interpretation, what kind of variables researchers they choose, and what kind of interpretation they develop. That can be different interpretation. There's possibility of variations in interpretation. So interpretivism takes this idea that understanding evolves through different kind of meanings, multiple meanings, and we can have multiple perspectives also, and depending on the experiences, and we can have a different kind of knowledge sources. So research philosophy in interpretivism actually develops this point that we can have a different interpretations in research, and depends on the researcher's point of view, what he or she wants to precisely interpret in the research. So interpretivism is not like critical realism or the positivism. So again, we have to understand the postmodernism, and in the postmodernism we have to understand, let's talk about that. First we talk about this modernism, right? In the modernism, what happened actually, we have to understand. In the modernism, we talk about the single structure, right? So what modern thinkers, philosophers, they believe in, that there's scientific reality having the one structure, and once we understand the structure, we know the reality in a particular way. Let's talk about the Wittgenstein. In his first book, Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, he talks about that there is parallelism between the word, right, and language. He talk about this parallelism between word and language, and then he argues that there is kind of isomorphism between the word, the way things are existing, and the language we use to represent that word. So that kind of structuralism we find in the Wittgensteinian philosophy also. And later on, he talks about that there's possibility of multi-structures. So in postmodernism, what we see, that there are different ways of understanding. There's a possibility of different different ideas, and they don't believe on the fixed identity. They don't believe in the fixed structures. They use they understand the reality in terms of power equations, and they have the multiple ways of understanding the research ideas and defining, explaining the research analysis. So postmodernism actually it takes all sorts of ideas in understanding and knowledge in conducting the researches. So postmodernism is it's not very clear to define, even because it does not leave anything so in its account. So postmodernism, of course, we have to understand, they believe on the multiple meanings, multiple structures, multiple identities, and they also, of course, they explain the things in terms of the society, social structure, race, gender, class, caste, and these all ideas they utilize in their explanations, right? So let's talk about the pragmatism, the last research philosophy let's talk about the pragmatism, what it is. So as I told you, pragmatism is based on the utilitarian philosophy, that we have to maximize goodness for maximum number of people. And there are two things are very important in the pragmatism we see. First is the action, and second is the problem solving. Okay, so problem solving is very gut of this pragmatism in researchers, and if you want to resolve any problem in research, you actually use the pragmatism, right? So first we see the insight or recognition we have in the researchers, right? And we go for the literature review, and then we formulate our research questions, and then accordingly we have design, and we define, and we realize, and use the most suitable research framework. That's a very important thing, right? Because we use the most suitable research framework because we want to resolve all sorts of problems. So finding the solutions to practical problems is the approach of the pragmatism. So after discussing these all 5 research philosophies, right? Positivism, critical realism, interpretivism, postmodernism, and pragmatism, let's move to a detailed discussion by making a comparison of these 5 research philosophies, and we'll try to understand these 5 research philosophies by taking the example of COVID-19. Latest example we will take here, right? COVID-19, because it has been impacted greatly whole world, right? So let me tell you, first of all, throughout the discussion, I tried to provide a general view on these all research philosophies for a fresh researcher. Otherwise, it requires a lot of time to discuss each of the research philosophies. So what I'm taking here in this lecture, I'm taking the fresh researcher's point of view, and that you can have a kind of general idea about the research philosophies, right? So that you can actually understand the basic components of each research philosophies. So let's try to understand each philosophy in terms of ontology, epistemology, axiology, and the typical methods they adopt. So first we try to understand, as I told you, when you talk about the ontology in the research point of view, that's about the nature of reality or being. Okay, so let's try to analyze interpretivism, the way they have this ontological basis, epistemological basis, axiological basis, and what kind of methods, typical methods they adapt in the research analysis or in the researchers, right? So ontology, if we talk about the positivism, right, then positivism, as I told you, it depends on the something which is real, which is external. For example, if I say this is a black pen, right? So this is real, right? And why it is real, and it is external, independent in the way that I can have a sense experience of this black pen, right? And this black pen actually objectively exists independent of my mind, right? Okay, so that's kind of positivism. We have to understand. They try to explain the ontology in terms that things, they really exist, they externally exist, they are independent to us, and they talk about the one true reality. That's kind of universalism. We can say that there is a kind of reality, that there's a universal sort of structure that correspond to one reality, and the things are granular, things are the things they compose the structure, and there's kind of order in this nature, right? So that's kind of ontology we see in positivistic research philosophy, and that's why we have to understand. That's I also discussed in the last lecture that in 1924, when we talked about the rise of Vienna Circle in UK by the efforts of mathematicians, logicians, scientists. We talked about the way they critically analyzed the metaphysical account in philosophy, and they rejected philosophy, and they talked about later on like AJ talked about the verification theory, and Carnap also talks about the falsification theory. And these scholars actually try to convey the fact that we need to adapt scientific methods. So of course, when we talk about the epistemology, what constitutes acceptable knowledge, or we can say the principles of knowledge, how do we know, is a basic question in epistemology that I discussed. So let's talk about in the positivism, we talk about the scientific method, and scientific method means that something we can observe, right, and something not only we can observe, but we can we can actually quantify. Actually, we can have data on that observable thing, and we can calculate. We can have the statistics of that data, right? So that's the epistemological methods we can adapt in the positivism, right? And then we, based on this objectivity, based on this data, based on this scientific method, we can have law-like generalizations, like we have the principle in sciences for which all the scientists, they agree, and they have general principles for each and everything when they define. And then of course, based on this general principle, they are based on the causal explanation, right? So they can explain how the event actually takes place in nature, and what are the cause and what is the effect, and what is the whole design of the event in terms of the causal explanation and prediction as contribution. And according to this kind of causal interpretation, generalizations, objectivity, they can have a good strong predictions, right? And now, so let's try to understand first of all that positivism is value-free research, right? It's objective, independent, right, point of view. So in this view, that you cannot be biased. You need to be unbiased in your research point of view. So researcher is detached, neutral, and independent of what is researched, right? And researcher maintains objective stance. That's very important. So unbiasedness and the objective stance, they become the mark of the positivist research philosophy, right? And then we have to understand that that's researcher detached, neutral, and independent. These are important points here in this positivist research philosophy. So of course, when we have to we adapt to this research philosophy, positivism, we typically have deductive, highly structured, large samples, right, that we can measure, and we can use the quantitative methods. Typically we can use the quantitative analysis, and a range of data can be analyzed, right, in that quantitative analysis. So let's try to understand our case study. That's we talk about the COVID-19 from the perspective of the positivistic research philosophy. So of course, when we talk about the COVID-19 virus and the way it has been affecting the whole world. So first we talk about that COVID-19 is not a creation. It's not a social creation. It's not a cultural creation. It's not artifact. But no, it's kind of reality that we can observe, right? Even we have the some views that it has been created by the doctors or the pathologists, but we have to understand that there is a kind of reality which is external to us, right, which is independent, and we can adapt scientific method. We can observe the infection, right, through the scientific methods. Like we have the testing kits to observe the COVID-19 infections, and we can have a causal infection also in terms that when COVID affects, right, then we see how it's affecting the human organs, vital organs, how it is affecting the lungs, liver, and the other organs, and we have the other symptoms also, like we have cough, cold, and these all the we have, and based on this causal explanations, we can have prediction of this infection, that if you are suffering with some symptoms like that, then there's possibility that you are COVID infected, right? So here you can't have any biased attitude to COVID-19, that you are like you belong to strong builds, right? You are very strong, you are fat, you are tall, or you belong to a very upper class. You are less exposed to the bad environment. You are from the rich class, sort of thing. This sort of thing, they don't work in this positivistic research philosophy. You can be infected, right, based on the scientific understanding and based on the in the symptoms, right? Then we have to understand that this is a way we can understand the COVID-19 through the scientific method, testing and symptoms, and we can have the cause and effect understanding also in the way it affects the human body, right? Let's move to the the second major research philosophy, that is critical realism. So first we try to understand in terms of ontology, what kind of ontology we find in this research philosophy, namely critical realism. So we see that that stratified, layered the empirical, the actual and the real. That's a great thing. So here we see the three levels the reality is actually structured. First we see the the empirical, what we actually experience as a reality, right? And then the actual, what is the thing, the way it exists, and then we talk about the reality, the way we perceive the reality. There are three levels of realities. So and then of course it is again talk about the external, independent and intransient also. So it is objective kind of realism, right, that independently exists outside of mind, but still it has three levels of the reality, right? We discussed empirical, actual and the real, right? And then it has ontological structures, objective ontological structures, and again we can talk about the causal mechanisms in this kind of critical realism research perspective. So we have to understand here, right, it's not about that there is a fixed structure, right, that positivist defines, right? Of course it is objective, of course it is observable, of course there's a causal determinism sort of thing, but still we have to understand there is three levels of understanding the reality, and there are gaps in that. So we have to be critical to reality, as that the actual reality differs from the empirical reality that we sense experience, and the reality in itself. These three can be different sort of reality, and that's where we have to critical understanding the reality, right? So again, when we talk about the epistemological point of view in this relativism, so of course we have talked about it is relative, it is not universal sort of thing, right? It is relative to the observer, relative to the different different facts also, right? So here in this critical realism we have to understand that it is different from the universalism, right? In universalism we have the generalization like principles, we have the one universal understanding about the one structure of reality, or one one idea in research. But in critical realism we have to depend on the relativism. That's where we can have the multiple ways of understanding the objective reality, right? And then we have to understand knowledge historically situated and transient. So of course critical realists, they try to understand each and everything from the historical point of view, the way it has evolved, developed and changed, right? And then they structure the research ideas accordingly. And then the facts are social constructions. So they talk about the facts are social constructions, okay, that there is no universal fact. And so we can say a kind of a kind of social relativism we see in this a kind of a social relativism we find here, right, in this theory, right? So social relativism depends on the different societies and culture. We can have different meanings to the reality, and they are constructed by the society. They're not derived from any universal structure, are not based on universal structure, but they are relative to social constructions, and they are historically caused, right? They are historically caused, and then we can have a causal explanation, not only based on the objective facts, scientific facts. Here we have the causal explanation based on the history and based on the social constructions also. And then when we talk about the axiology, the role of values, of course here we have the importance of values that we attach to the understanding of our realities, right? So they value led in research. Here the emphasis is on the value, right? Researchers' knowledge is biased by worldviews. So look, the worldview we carry about the word, the ways the thing exists, the way we craft our definitions in understanding. So here researchers acknowledge bias by worldviews. We can have different kind of worldviews to the certain research entities understandings, and accordingly we can be biased. It's not like positivists that you are neutral, unbiased and objective because you are based on the universal sort of thing. So here researchers' involvement we see in the critical realism, and then that is also because of the cultural experience and upbringing. That then the society, culture, history, we see the three counts here in this critical realism. We see the impact of the historical causes, historical changes, and then we see the impact of the social relativism, and then we see the impact of the cultural relativism also, and the cultural experience also. That also creates a kind of sense and the real sense of reality. The researchers tries to minimize bias and errors. Here we have to understand that because our views in the realism, right, we have to be critical. So in being critical, you have to minimize the bias and errors, right? And researcher has to be objective as possible, because we have to understand that reality can be relative and culturally shaped, socially shaped, and historically shaped. So here we have to understand that in critical realism, a researcher has to be critical in minimizing the biasness, right? And he has to, or she has to be at best be objective as much as possible, considering that the reality is structured and impacted by the history, culture, and history, culture, and the social relativism. They are the factors. They actually they make the different ways, they corrupt the reality in different ways. So we have to critical, we have to unbiased, we have to objective in making our research findings very clear for the researchers. So again, we have to understand that we in this in this critical realism, we adapt to retroductive analysis, in-depth historically situated analysis of pre-existing structures and emerging agencies, right? As I've told you that here the reality is historically shaped, so we have to take the historical point of view in our study methods also, in our quantity method, quantifying the research methods also. So here we see the range of methods and data types to fit the subject matter. So again, when we talk about the COVID-19 from the viewpoint of critical realism, so we see that we can have some understanding about the pandemics, the way pandemics have occurred in the history, and the way society has reacted to the pandemic, and how pandemic is differently defined by the society in different cultures. Like if we compare from the west to east, we find that West actually they give more emphasis on the cleanliness and the other factors, and they talk about and they are very severely feared by the infections, and that also affected their immunity sort of thing, and they're combating to this COVID infection. However, in different cultures like in India, if you observe, then initially people were not very fearing to this COVID infection. Later on, when they understood the whole reality in different ways, they start acting proactive and taking the whole measures to avoid the infections. So you have to understand how pandemic has affected the society and culture, how society has responded to the pandemic. So of course, considering COVID-19, we can have the critical realist perspective also, but we have to understand that if we go back to the 6, 7, 8 months ago, we found that people started interpreting COVID-19 in terms of the in the ways that they talk about the elections, and they talk about the coexistence of COVID-19, severity of COVID-19 and rise of infection, and that connecting with the elections also. So these sort of relative definitions, relative understanding we find. So again, we have to understand here, when you research on the COVID-19 from a critical realist perspective, then you can adapt historical point of view to understand the pandemics, how they have occurred and how they have affected the society, and what kind of measures people have taken to avoid infections or to to stop the spread of the pandemic. So that kind of perspective you can adapt, and you can have a comparison in between two different cultures also. So that's where critical realism can be really interesting, interesting research philosophy to conduct a research. So now let's take about the third major research philosophy, which is interpretivism. So in interpretivism, as I told you, it's really very complex. Okay, it's a rich, socially constructed through culture and language. Okay, so interpretivism takes on to different societies, different cultures, different meaning, multi meanings also. So of course we can't have one universal, simple, objective, real structure, but of course we have the multiple structure, multiple meanings, and multiple interpretations and realities we find, and we find the flux of process. You cannot say that something is fixed, like one meaning or one reality or one perspective is fixed in this philosophy. Everything is in the continuum. It's shaping, it's changing. It is it is taking different shapes of meaning, multiple meanings. So in interpretivism, it depends on the interpretations. So of course we, as a taking the epistemology, we adapt different theories and concepts to simplistic and focus on narrative stories, perceptions and interpretations. So that is where you can understand we can have a complex meanings, and because here we are focusing on the culture, society, narrative stories, perceptions and interpretations, and new understanding and worldviews as contributions. So of course interpretivism depends on the cultural perspective, depends on the different social constructed realities, and then of course it brings new understanding, new meanings, and depends more on the researchers' interpretations also. So it's of course, when we talk about the axiological point of view in this interpretivism, we find the value bound research, right? Researchers are part of what is research, and it is subjective. That's contrast to positivistic research philosophy we find here, because here you are not objective, you are very subjective, and as a researcher, right, like poetic novelists, right, and even historians sometimes, and the researchers in on the political ideologies also, sometimes they are very highly subjective with certain cultural, social and historical perspectives, and sometimes they come with a new idea, but it's grounded in the very one's researcher's point of view. So interpretations key to contribution. Here we have the different interpretations. We can have a multiple interpretation, like a novelist can have a different interpretation on the same COVID-19, painter can have a different interpretation, a scientist can have a different interpretation, but still this research philosophy, interpretivism, when researcher adapts, then is going to create a new meaning, and he is going to be subjectively involved in that. So it is a kind of researcher's reflexive. It's the way researchers understand this multiple structure, complex structures and social construction meaning, and he also involves in that in terms of analyzing, interpreting certain point of views, and it shows researchers reflects. So in this we see about the methodologies adapted in this interpretivism. We find inductive small samples. It's not based on the big data, which is on the quantitative studies, but it is on the interviews, depth investigations. They more adapt qualitative methods of analysis, but a range of data can be interpreted. So interviews, questionnaire, and small samples, accordingly they can have the interpretation based on this all findings. So here we finished our detailed interpretations. So now let's summarize what we have done in this lecture. So first we tried to understand the research from the fresh researcher's perspective. There we talked about propositions and hypothesis, right? And then we moved to the next level of the inquiry in this lecture, which was based on philosophical aspect of the research conduct, where we talked about the ontology, metaphysics, epistemology, and methodology, right? They are really basic components of the research, right? And then we moved in the end about the discussion on research philosophies, and that's where we talked about the positivism, we talked about the critical realism, we talked about the interpretivism, we talked about the postmodernism, and we talked about the pragmatism. So these are some references that I have used to prepare this lecture. You can also find them useful for your researchers. Thank you.